Matthew 18, verses 21 to 22. Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, Not 7 times, but I tell you, 77 times. I find forgiveness very difficult, both in giving and receiving. I hope I'm better than I used to be, but during ministerial training, in a period of harsh self-examination, I came to realise that I actually enjoyed not forgiving people. I should have taken the hint when my 4 children combined to buy me the book Grumpy Old Men, which I think was based on the BBC TV programme of the same name. I imagine I wasn't the easiest person in the world to live with, and not the greatest dad either. Sorry guys, I hope I've made up for it since then. And I'm very aware that there is a conversation to be had with my ex-wife as well. As Elton John sang, sorry seems to be the hardest word. Indeed. There are a whole range of emotions woven into forgiveness, at least from my perspective. The feeling of power over someone whom you feel has wronged you, and that they owe you until you've forgiven them. And the receiving of forgiveness can only occur if at first you recognise that you've been wrong, or done something hurtful in the first place. Am I not right all of the time? No. Pride, ego, power, humility, sympathy and love. They're all in there somewhere, either positively or negatively. And so we come to reflect on our passage from Matthew's Gospel, part of Jesus' conversation with his followers about forgiveness. In the passage immediately preceding our reading, Jesus is dealing with a question over how issues of conflict are dealt with in the wider community. And out of this discussion, Peter comes to him and asks the question about how many times someone should be forgiven. At this point, I need to ask you to take a metaphorical breath whilst I deal with a couple of textual issues. Please bear with me. The NRSV doesn't do us any favours with its translation, for it says, if another member of the church sins against me. I really don't know why they included church in the text, for A, the concept of church comes much later in the Good News story, and B, the Greek text doesn't say anything about church. It says, if my brother sins against me. So in my view, this is not Peter being upset with the quality of the coffee after the service, but his having been hurt by either Andrew or one of the disciples whom he regards as a brother. And whilst I'm being grumpy about the NRSV translation, 70 times 7 is a better translation than 77. For whenever we see a number in the Gospels, we need to be aware of a potentially deeper message. At various points in their history, the Jews put great store in assigning a symbolic meaning to a certain of their numbers. Scholars argue as to whether or not this was in vogue during Jesus' ministry, but it could mean that Peter is using the number 7 as meaning complete. Shall I forgive my brother completely? And Jesus could be using the number 70 to mean restoration. You must not only forgive him completely, but forgive him and restore the relationship between you. When Peter then looks blankly back at Jesus, which he does frequently in my imagination, Jesus offers a parable about a king and 2 servants. I've suggested in a previous sermon that hyperbole is often a key feature within the rabbinic tradition of parable telling, and this parable is no exception. There are several plot points missing here, but this is a story with a message. The first servant owes the king 10,000 talents. 1 talent is about 6,000 denarii, with each denarius worth a day's wage for a labourer. So, doing the sums, the debt is about 60 million denarii, an eye-watering amount, which no family could repay even over several lifetimes. The forgiving of this unforgivable debt is an act, therefore, of extravagant mercy. The second servant owes the first servant 100 denarii, a relatively small sum compared to what the servant owed the king, and therefore, having experienced the generosity of the king, you might expect the same to be shown within this second relationship, but instead the reaction is unsympathetic and even violent. There is no intention to forgive, let alone restoration. I mentioned earlier the power I felt in holding a grudge, and perhaps Jesus is drawing our attention to the truth that having received forgiveness, we should be prepared to offer it to others, as an act of restoration, an act which relies not on the individual offering forgiveness, but relies on the sympathetic reaction of both parties involved. The king has attempted to restore his relationship with the first servant, but on hearing that the servant has not reciprocated, and that the mercy shown by the king has not changed the heart of the servant, the king takes drastic action, having the servant tortured until he can repay the unrepayable debt. As the amount of the debt initially forgiven by the king is a figurative one, we may assume that the torture is similarly metaphorical, although there is a recurring theme within Matthew's Gospel of what is predicted to happen to those who receive God's mercy but don't walk in God's paths of righteousness. However, the same Gospel proclaims the promise that God's forgiveness, offered via the Messiah Jesus, is available to all, even to the most sinful of us. For me, the conversation with Peter and the parable reminds me that human forgiveness is limited, yet that offered by God knows no limit. It reminds me that forgiveness is not just an action of the mind and reason, but it's an action of the heart and the soul. It is an act of healing for both those who offer and those who receive. And the forgiveness is not forgive and forget, it's an act of restoration, an act that is not instantaneous, but may take time. It reminds me that forgiveness is at the heart of the gospel, the good news. For on the night when Judas betrayed him, and Peter of all people abandoned him, Jesus said, "This is the blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for all people, for the forgiveness of sins." Thanks be to God.